Hello and welcome to my webinar. This is a re-recording of a presentation given for a masterclass of executives in the pharmaceutical and medical technology sectors, but for the purposes of privacy of those who contributed to the masterclass, I've chosen to re-record it so that they could feel free to discuss what they wanted during the session itself. So if you'll allow me, I'll show you my slides and I'll begin. So, right now, all over the world, pharma and medtech companies are busy planning. It's an annual ritual that takes place every year in every life sciences company. Marketers, medics, market access, other functions are all working in cross-functional teams to develop brand plans or company level plans or business unit level plans. It's a very important process, one that takes up a lot of time and effort and resources, and one which is very important to the business, of course. But this year, as we all know, it's very different. Normally, the strategic plan involves lots of face-to-face meetings and presentations. But this year, those teams are working from home. And those face-to-face meetings, those presentations, they've largely been replaced by video calls or other remote methods. This is a big change, and it's a very sudden change. Unlike most of the changes in how we work, this one has happened in a very short period of time. For an academic researcher like me, this is an almost instant shift, and it's interesting to see what socially distanced strategizing does to the strategy process. It raises two important questions. First, does working at distance make a difference to strategic planning? And if it does, how can firms adapt to the new normal of socially distanced strategizing? Well, my work is throwing some light on that, and in the next 25-30 minutes, I'm going to cover that work in three sections, in three topics, I hope. The first thing I'm going to talk about is what really happens when cross-functional teams strategize. Then I want to talk about the impact of social distancing on that process. When I've done that, I then want to talk about the practical steps that firms can take to enable their teams to work together effectively, even when they're apart. Now, as you may know, I've spent 20 years in the industry in pharma and medtech, working in cross-functional teams, making strategy. Since then, I've spent another 20 years as an academic studying how life science companies make strategy. That's what my PhD was about. That's what all my books and my papers are about. And the most important thing that I've learned in all that study is that every firm has its own process, its own terminology, its own systems. Strategy making processes are like a human face. They're unique. Everyone's different. But the second thing I've learned is that underneath those superficial differences, every process has four basic parts. Just like every face has eyes, a nose, a mouth, and a chin, every strategic planning process has four essential features. We all start with some kind of sense-making step. This is the stage at which we translate the information we have about the market into knowledge and insights and that we need to make strategic decisions. Next comes the strategizing step. And then with strategizing step where we make those resource allocation decisions about where and how to create value in the marketplace. That's followed by the implementing step, when we break down those high-level decisions into smaller actions that will be implemented by the different functional teams. And then comes the measuring step, where we schedule all those actions and we set up metrics about how much we'll spend and what outcomes we'll expect from that spend. You probably recognize these steps in your own strategy process, just like your own face. The details are unique to your firm. And what I've said so far is pretty obvious, I think, to anybody who's ever been part of a strategy team. But I'm going to take you now into the unexplored territory, into areas that aren't so obvious. You see, it turns out that this four-stage process shown on the slide is only half of the strategy making story. And whenever I study real teams in the real world, I find things that are never written down in the textbooks, and they're hardly ever talked about. It's what I call this the shadow strategy making process. This is a series of activities that go on continuously and actively but invisibly behind these 4 visible steps. So, for example, behind the sense-making step, we make all kinds of hidden assumptions about what we already know, what we don't know, what we need to know. And these assumptions are important because they shape how we gather and process information and knowledge, which is important in a knowledge-making industry. Behind the strategizing step, the second step, we make assumptions about the differences between strong and weak strategy. And that's important because that determines what strategy is chosen. Behind the implementation step, we set and accept expectations about what each function can and should do. Those expectations determine how functions cooperate in conflict. And behind the measuring step, we reach unspoken agreements about how fast we can move and how effective we can be. Those agreements determine what we count as success and therefore what we change in the next planning cycle. If you're an experienced strategist, of course, you recognize that this implicit process goes on all of the time beneath the explicit planning process. In fact, the main advantage that experience gives strategists is an appreciation of how this shadow process works. But here's the important thing that experience teaches strategists. This shadow process in the grey boxes here, it's important, but it never happens in the meetings. It mostly happens over coffee or in corridors or at the water cooler or when travelling together. It's essentially an informal complement to the formal process, just like an adjuvant is a complement to a vaccine. So the question becomes, how is this shadow process relevant to socially distanced strategizing? Well, I try to understand this by studying how strategy teams work, and the strategy teams I study differ in 2 important ways. They differ in how effective they are at creating strong strategies, because teams vary in how great they are at making strategy. And teams vary in how physically close the team is, because even before COVID, of course, many strategy teams worked in the same office, but many also worked spread around the world. And these 4 situations provide, if you like, a kind of natural experiment, like comparing how different plants grow in different soils and different weather conditions. And by comparing what goes on here and asking the right sorts of questions, I can draw some interesting conclusions. You see, when I look in the first box at teams that are effective and are physically together, I find that both the visible and the shadow processes are working at the same time, working well. But when I look at teams that are still together but don't work very well, I find it's not usually the visible process that doesn't work, it's the invisible process, the shadow process that breaks down. Usually in this case because of inter-organizational conflict and politics between departments. And I've written many papers on that. In teams that are ineffective on the distance, you still see the same problem, the visible process working, the shadow process not working, but this time it's not the politics so much as it's the lack of communication that gets in the way. The distance hinders the shadow process. But then the most important results, I think, are in the 4th box, when teams are distant but still effective. In those cases, I find that the visible process works well, but they found some way of making the shadow process work well, despite the distance. Now, those observations that I see happening in teams lead me to 4 important conclusions, I think, about how to make strategy. I think the first one is that to work well, a strategy process must have both the visible and the shadow processes working at the same time. This makes sense because they're a bit like hardware and software, they work together. Secondly, when there's physical distance involved, it seems to have little impact on the visible process. Now that makes sense because The visible process is all about sharing documentation, and that's done by technology, and the technology, of course, now doesn't care whether you share it across a desk or across continents. Then the third lesson I take from this is that what social distancing does affect is the shadow process, not the visible process, but the shadow process. And that's because the shadow process happens during informal social interactions, and it's those that are limited or curtailed by remote working. And the final one, that perhaps is the most interesting of all, is that some firms have found ways of protecting the shadow process against the negative effects of social distancing. This is the new finding. It's obviously the one that's worth looking at more closely. So this changes the question to what can we learn from those pharma and medtech companies that have made the shadow process work despite social distancing? Well, the answer is in two parts. Excuse me. It's in what they do and how they do it. What they do is to make the important parts of the shadow process visible and explicit. They effectively take it out of the shadows and into the visible process. How they do this is by challenging the team members to answer some carefully chosen questions before they engage in the visible strategy process. I'll say more about how that's done in a moment, but first of all, you need to understand that this approach differs in three ways from traditional ways of companies preparing for strategic plans. Firstly, this process is not the typical process of teams gathering facts in preparation for the meeting. The aim here is not about gathering facts, but about provoking thought so that the team can challenge the cognitive framework in which they do their strategic planning. Secondly, this isn't just about asking one set of questions about the overall strategy. It's about asking 4 specific sets of questions, one set for each of the 4 steps of the visible strategy process. Thirdly, these questions aren't about asking for feedback, about opinions on someone else's work. They are about forcing original thought, not criticism of other people's ideas. So that's the general idea of how firms make strategizing work at a distance. But I'm sure you want more detail than that, so let me give you an example of how this works in those pharma and medtech companies I've worked with that are effective at this. At the first step, the sense-making step, team members are asked structured questions about the different forms of knowledge needed to make strategy. Knowledge management experts call these declarative, procedural, and causal knowledge. In a physically close team, this usually happens unconsciously as part of the social process. But in a socially distanced team, this socialization is reduced, so the process has to be made more deliberate, more conscious by asking these deliberate questions. This template is one that I developed from working with teams on this. The examples, of course, are illustrative and simplified. In practice, the template is more complex and case-specific than this. But if you use it well, this sort of approach at the sense-making stage results in a team that is clear about what it needs to know and about how to generate that necessary new knowledge. This happens, of course, in socially close-up teams, but in the socially distanced teams, it needs to be helped along by these additional questions. In practice, there are 3 tricks of the trade in making this work. You need to understand technically the differences between data, information, knowledge, and insight. They're not all the same thing, and they have different meanings and values. You have to understand the differences between these 3 different forms of knowledge, because different forms of knowledge have different uses, and they often come from different sources. And you need to understand how to create insight from knowledge. There are 3 forms of insight creation process, and they're useful in different situations, and you need to know which one to use. But that's just the first step. The second step has a different set of questions. When we're trying to build a consensus about what strong strategy is, it's best before to ask structured questions about the strength of various strategy alternatives. That is, questions about how likely each alternative strategy is to deliver on its promises to achieve its objectives. So this template shows an example of this. Again, it's simplified to illustrate the point, but in practice it would be more tailored, more specific. Okay? But here we ask questions about things to do with what affects the probability of delivering on your promises for different strategy options. In a physically closed team, this tends to happen during the back and forth of discussion with the team. In a socially distanced team, there's less opportunity for that, so it needs to be helped along by these very specific, explicit questions. When it's used diligently, this approach leads to a team that is not only confident in the strategy it will deliver, but it understands and agrees why they are confident, and therefore the team is capable of defending it against challenges by colleagues and superiors. When teams are all in the same building, a lot of this tends to happen by socialization of the strategy, by people talking about it. But social distance reduces that socialization, which means that the strategy process needs to be helped along by these explicit questions. Again, there are tricks of the trade in making this work. In this case, it's about having a strong technical knowledge about marketing theory, such as the definition of what a risk strategy is, and what tactics are, and what a segment really is, and what are the differences between strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and so on. At the implementation step, the third step, teams are asked questions about how their tactical programs fit with the strategy, fit with the goals, fit with the resources they have, and fit with the other tactical programs. And they're asked to identify ways of improving that fit. Again, in a physically closed team, this tends to happen during reiteration of the tactics as gaps and conflicts become clear when teams talk to each other. But in a socially distanced team, this happens less, so it has to be made more deliberate and explicit by asking these questions. Again, this is a simplified template. In practice, it will be more tailored, more specific to the case, but hopefully it illustrates the point. Again, when used diligently, this approach leads to an implementation program where the programs are consistent with the strategy and they're consistent with each other. There are no gaps, no conflicts, and it can be executed within resources. Although this happens during all the reiteration of strategy in an office, in a social distance situation, it needs to be helped along. Again, there are tricks of the trade of making this work. One of them is to make sure that your strategy is well defined in the first place, that's in the previous step. And the other one is to look for the different types of synergy between programs, internal synergy, external synergy, which is something firms quite often misunderstand the mechanism of. That's the third step. At the fourth step, the measuring step, team members ask structured questions about what they want to measure and why they want to measure them. Again, in a physically closed team, the metrics evolve as the teams ask each other lots of questions during informal encounters. But in a socially distanced team, this happens much less, so the process has to be helped along by asking the formal questions. A good result is when the team know what they want to measure and why they want to measure what they'll use the metrics for. Incidentally, the key to making this work, the trick of the trade in this fourth stage, is to make the information systems provide the metrics you need and not to set your metrics around what your information systems will give you. That would be what one of my research respondents called the tail wagging the dog. So that's an overview of what strategy teams do to enable this shadow strategy process to work even during social distancing. In short, they make the shadow process visible and explicit by asking these specific, careful, tailored questions. The aim, of course, is to take untested assumptions and make them tested, to take this tacit consensus and make it open consensus, to take implicit expectations and make them explicit expectations, and to take unspoken agreements and make them transparent. In a socially closed team, this should happen anyway, but when the team is separated, this process needs help, and that's what this process is for. But there's one more thing I wanted to talk about that came out of the findings that I thought you would find interesting. These questions are not simple to answer, they're difficult, they need a lot of intelligent thought. And not every team member thinks the same way. Some of us like to think aloud and develop our ideas by bouncing them off teams of colleagues. That's what extroverts do. Some of us think better alone and develop ideas best in silent internal conversations in our heads. That's what introverts do. I found that this process that we talked about today, this shifting of the shadow process, allows team members to think in a way that suits their best. Extroverts, for example, can be given the questions and then they can form a separate sub-meeting to discuss their ideas and talk about each other. Introverts are given the questions and allowed to go away and think about it, time and space to think, which is what they need. And neither of those two groups is forced to think like the other one. And it's only when they've finished doing the thinking in the way they choose to think that they get together into the strategy group meetings and do the visible part of the strategy process. So, moving towards a summary now. Effective teams make strong strategy even when socially distanced. They do this by asking structured questions. Questions that are designed to shift the strategy process, which is normally informal and invisible, into the visible strategy process. The nature of these questions is really important. They're not simply comment on this document type questions. They're carefully designed with the intent to enable what normally happens over coffee or on an aeroplane or in the corridor to happen when that informal socializing isn't possible. It might sound very complicated, but in practice it's not. It's probably what you do a lot of it already, but it's the implicit and informal brought out of the channels and made formal and explicit. Further, this approach has the advantage of allowing for cognitive diversity within the team, allowing your introverts and your extroverts to work the way that works best for them. I'm going to leave you with one other thought about strategizing at a distance. You might ask if you really need to change your strategy process. I think a better question is, why would you expect it to stay the same? We know the world's changed. We know it's very unlikely that things will return to the status quo before COVID. We also know that in a changing world, that ability to evolve is the only truly sustainable competitive advantage. So one way of looking at what I've talked about today is that what I've talked about is the mechanism of how firms evolve their strategizing process to fit this new normal. My aim in giving this masterclass is to help you evolve the way that you make strategy for these new and interesting, difficult times. Because in the end, there is only one alternative to evolution, and that is extinction. So thank you very much for your attention to my work and your interest in my work. If you'd like to know more about it, then all of my details are here in the final slide. I'll be very happy for you to send me an email or to call me, and I'll be very happy to discuss how this works in practice and perhaps how it applies to your organization. Thank you very much for your time and attention.